How to paint a bird in watercolour. Today I've got 10 do's and don'ts for bird paintings. I've also got a bonus tip for you that's going to help your bird to look really alive. Welcome back to my channel. If you are new here, my name is Michelle, and on this channel you'll find all things watercolour, as well as some drawing, mixed media tips and techniques, even business and motivation for artists too. Please do consider subscribing. If you click the bell icon, you'll get notified every time I have a new video for you. I make at least one free video a week here on Thursdays with extra content for Patreon subscribers. So from my earliest days of starting to paint, I've always painted birds. They're just a really great subject, aren't they? And many artists do them. I've done them in mosaic, I've done them in lino prints, and more often than not, I've done them in watercolours too. Now, when painting birds, of course, you've got all the difficulties of things like feathers, just like if you're painting animals and you've got fur. I do find that a few mixed media tips can really help you with your bird painting. So I've got 10 do's and don'ts here that are going to help you to produce a beautiful bird painting of your own. At the end of this video, I've got a bonus tip. It's a little trick that nobody will know that you've done it, but it's going to actually help your bird's eye look like it's really bright and alive. So do keep watching to the end of the video for that one, and let's get on with my 10 do's and don'ts for bird paintings. Now, although I hate to be negative, I'm going to start with a don't, and that's don't start your painting until your drawing is correct and you're happy with it, because so many times, and this applies to any subject really, but so many times over the years, I've had a student ask me to help fix their work and the underdrawing is just wrong. If your drawing is wrong, there's nothing anyone can do to help you fix the painting, unless of course it's something like oils and you can go over the top of everything. We don't have that option in most mediums, however, so you do want to make sure that your drawing is correct. I've got some tips for you on how to draw birds accurately. They're quite a simple shape, which means they're easy to get wrong, but they're also quite complex in their own way. So let me show you how to draw an accurate bird. So let's look at the idea of drawing birds. So I've got a few photographs here. Apologies if some of them are a bit scruffy. I do use them for teaching art classes. So we've got sort of fellas here, like these short fat chaps. Look at him, very plump. And then we've got these kind of long slender fellas like this one. This is the bird that I painted recently. I'll show you that painting in a little while. So you can see they're all different shapes and sizes, but they do have this kind of commonality in that there's almost a teardrop shape to a lot of them, a pear shape. Almost some of the cases you have these shapes that kind of curl round like a paisley pattern would do on a shirt, something like that. So we've got that idea of this sort of the slightly rounded shape, and then of course there's the head as well. The beaks are something that people often get wrong. They do actually go into the head shape. I mean, probably if it didn't have feathers, they'd just be sitting on the outside, but one mistake that people often make is to put the beak outside of the head shape rather than sort of slotting it in, as it were. But first of all, you're just looking at the overall shape. Now, one thing you can do, you want to look really about where the bird is going to fit on your painting, on your picture, and maybe make a mark for how high it's going to come, how low. You can look at the angle through the body, just get an idea of where it's going to sit on your painting, rather than just starting randomly drawing and hoping that it fits. I won't go into that sort of thing too much in this video, but I do have lots of other videos that talk quite a lot about how to lay out a painting and how to make sure things are the right size, so do check those out. But we'll just have a look at the shapes of the bird today, so let's have a look at drawing them. If you've ever seen cartoonists, what they do is they use circles and squares and oblong shapes in order to get basic shapes for people and animals, and that's a really good approach for birds like this. So rather than starting your drawing, starting drawing the head and putting the beak in and the eye and then trying to attach some kind of body to it, tends to go very wrong. So what you want to do instead is look at the overall shape. So with this one here, for instance, I always see, although they don't have a neck as such, there's always this line where the head seems to sit. I mean, imagine if it had no feathers, I'm sure it would have a form of neck. But you can see it quite distinctly here with this sparrow as well. So you can see this line here, so you want to be thinking about that as well. And so I'll be looking, with this, about thinking of the overall shape of the bird, almost without the head first of all. Headless bird, there you go. Get a gothic form of drawing on this channel. And then once you've got that overall shape of the body, you can think about where the wings, the tail goes, and looking. Each bird head shape is different. Some of them seem to be sort of quite long and thin like this one, and then others, in fact I've done that too big, I would say. You can see here I'm sketching really, really lightly and not being at all detailed at this stage, and this is what you want to do. You want to get this part right before you worry about anything more detailed. It wants to be as loose as that. And then of course maybe you can see the feet on this chap. He's so fluffy you can't see his feet. And of course you've got the beak. So with things like beaks and mouths in humans, you want to usually start by drawing the center line. If you start by drawing the center line, you tend to get a good idea of how everything sits. And then of course, in fact, I think that should be more upright. This is the reason you draw lightly, so that you can adjust. So I think we'll go a little bit more upright with that. And then you can put the beak shape around it, and they usually fit into the face something like this. I mean, I'm being a little cartoony there, but you can see what I mean. Eyes are quite difficult with birds. This one's quite handy because he's got some markings, so we could almost sort of sketch those markings in, couldn't we, and start thinking about where the eye would come in relation to those markings. So that's something that you can use as well. These markings coming around here, and then we've almost got with him, there's almost a stripe of a marking along there, and then you could say, well, the eye sits about here. But in many birds there is no point of reference whatsoever for where you put the eye. That eye is too large, but we're not going to worry too much about details. Again, with these birds here, I seem to have picked up birds that have this very handy kind of line here to place the eye in. But with many birds, these ones all seem to have markings, but with many birds there's just nothing here at all, and you sort of you're left with this sort of no point of reference. So you just have to kind of figure out whereabouts it is in the head, and comparing to the beak as well. So that's something to consider as well. That can be quite difficult. With larger birds, let's look at a more slender shaped bird. Let's look at this hummingbird here. So we've got our short fat bird here. And he's so fat, his legs aren't showing, and the hummingbird's legs aren't showing either, actually. But where you do have legs that are showing, you want to put them in afterwards. You just place them in. You want to get that overall shape of the body, and then the head and any wings. That's what you want to look at first. So with this one here, though we've got the wings and all of this, again, you don't want to start drawing by going around the outside and trying to go up across the wing. You'd only end up getting it wrong. So you want to look at the body shape. So let's look at the body shape of this one here. Bit less room left here. Let me move my drawing board, and let's think about this. So the shape that I see here, if we ignore the head, I'm kind of going up, and then there's almost this sort of thing. So it comes down, and you're looking at this kind of shape. So it's a different kind of shape, but you can see it's still got that teardrop effect. And then with this, there's a lot more of what I would call neck on this bird, and then we look at the head shape as well. So try to almost forget that it's a bird until you have got that outside shape, because your brain has preconceptions about the shape of things, and what you really want to do is get the idea of it being almost an abstract shape. So it's not a bird, it's just a shape. And if it were just a shape, what shape would it be? Because as soon as you start telling yourself, well, it's a bird, you'll start to make, especially if it's a bird that you've seen quite a lot, you'll have preconceived ideas in your brain of what it looks like, which may not necessarily be correct. Again, you can then use those to try and place the eye. The eye is much bigger on the hummingbird. So once we've got this body shape, we then can think about whereabouts the wings come, what shape they are, and we can start getting those in. I'm going to run out of paper here, aren't I? And we can start getting those wing shapes in like so. So you can see different approach, but yet the same method. So you want to look at the overall shape of the body, then you want to look at the shape of the head. As I said, it varies from sort of short and squat and long like this to fairly slender like this one here. If you're at all unsure about the shape, there are various tricks that you can do, which you may have heard of, such as turning your picture and your photograph upside down. If you're finding it hard to just visualize what the shape is, that's something you can do. And once you've got this rough drawing, then you can go in, you can, get things a little bit more precise if you need to, and then you can start to get to the point where you can perhaps rub out some of those scruffier lines and just clean things up a little bit. But you don't want to go onto that stage until you've got the overall shape of your bird correct, and you don't want to go onto painting at all until everything in your picture is laid out nicely and you're quite certain that it's all going to fit where you want it. So let's look at something more positive now. Let's look at a do. I do want you to plan your background before you start painting your bird. Now, you don't have to have a background behind your bird, but if you're going to have one, it's quite important that you think about that first for some very specific reasons. Let me show you what I mean. So I've got a piece of paper here. I've put some samples in here just because I need some dry paint, so we'll be using those later. Let's look at this idea of placing the background in. So why is it important to think about it first? The reason is because when you look at the outside of a bird, you have both hard and soft edges within birds. So you may find that there are quite a lot of hard edges around your bird, but then also there will be some soft edges. Let's look at another one. Again here you've got harder edges, you've got soft edges here. You have areas that are, for want of a better word, fluffy. So let's find our bird that we looked at earlier, and you see how fluffy he is around here, how soft. Now imagine if you put a background in and you went all the way around here and you painted a real hard edge here. It's not going to work. So what you can do when you're putting in a background is you can think ahead and you can allow for the fact that areas of the bird are fluffy, and you can leave a soft edge around the bird when you place the background in. Don't worry if you don't know how to do that. I'm going to show you in a moment. Another thing you also want to consider is light and dark. So for instance, look at the top of the bird here is fairly dark and you've got a lighter branch behind. Now, if you had painted this and you'd painted in this branch behind really dark and then the top of the bird was dark, it's not going to show up. So you also want to be thinking about, when you put your background in, which parts of the bird are dark. You want to go a little bit lighter in the background there, and vice versa. You don't have to get all of the background in at the beginning, and you don't always have to paint the background first, but if you've got soft fluffy edges and you know you're going to want a background behind, you really have to get that in first. So let's look at this idea of a hard or a soft edge when you're going around a bird. So let's do a little bit of drawing. So let's imagine that we have a bird, and let's say that his beak is up here, and so we're sort of we're kind of drawing the area that would be his tummy, and let's say that he has quite hard-edged feathers here, and then as they go round to the bottom of the tummy here, they become much softer and much fluffier. So what we can do is, as you're putting your background in, and we'll imagine we're using sort of a wet into wet background here, I'm just going to grab, I've got a little bit of some cerulean blue to the side of me here, so let's come here, and we're going here on dry paper, and I'm coming round. I'm going to actually work some other colours in there just to give it a bit of interest. So I've got a little bit of lemon over the side here, so put a bit of green in there. So imagine we're doing this nice wet into wet background around the bird, and he's nice and he's hard edged here, but then as we come down to the base of the tummy, we know that he's going to start getting a bit fluffier. It's going to be quite hard to depict that. An easier way of doing it actually is to allow for it as you put your background in. So as we come down here, I'm going to clean my paintbrush and I'm going to put some clean water along this edge, and I'm going a little way into the bird, you can see here, and we'll come up here so this doesn't dry, and then we'll carry on round. So going back to my blue paint, coming down here, and you can see I'm going around the bird now, but I'm actually getting a much softer, fluffier line because I've taken that water into the body of the bird. I'll put a bit more colour on so you can see it more clearly. So can you see how we have this sharp, hard edge here where the bird's feathers are sharp, and then where the bird's feathers are going to be fluffy, we're allowing for it in advance by putting water on the paper first. You have to take it a fair way into the bird as well. It's very easy to come off the water. We can further manipulate this, and bearing in mind that I have to have my board tilted, and it's actually tilted downwards away from me. It will look the other way around on camera, but for various reasons I have the board tilted. So what I can do here is I can place some more water in here. So I'm going wetter here. What this will do, and again it would work better if your board is flat and not on a tilt like mine, but what I can do is place water here. So I'm dripping water here. Now the paint was damp, not wet, and so by dripping water along this edge, what will happen is that water will start to want to bleed into the area that's damp. So we'll put this here. As I said, I'm going a bit against gravity here, so it will work better if you're on a flat edge. What's going to happen is that wet area is going to bleed out into the damp area, and you're going to get a beautiful fluffy edge that you've created before you've even started painting your bird. So another do for you now, do choose accurate colours. It's really important, particularly with things like animals, birds, flowers, plants, trees, that you choose accurate colours. And this can really be quite annoying for the viewer if they're looking at a bird painting, for instance, and the yellow or the blue is just the wrong colour. So this is really, really important, and you might be thinking, well, I just paint quite loosely anyway. Unless you paint sort of full-on fantasy, made up, you know, pink, blue and purple bird, then you do need to be accurate. And it's actually more important if you paint loosely that you are accurate, because there are very few things, if you haven't got accuracy in the drawing or the painting, there are very few things that tell the viewer what sort of bird it is, and accurate colour is one of those. So it's really important when you're trying to capture the essence of something that you get your colours correct. So let me point the camera downwards and show you what I mean. So let's talk about colour choice. This is the bird that I've just finished painting. If you would like the full tutorial for this bird, it's actually broken into 4 full-length tutorials on my Patreon website, because that's where I put longer tutorials. I simply can't do a tutorial like this, which is about 20 hours painting on YouTube. It wouldn't work. I want to talk about the colours that I chose for this bird. So let me find the original photograph, and here it is. And let's talk specifically about yellows. Now, what I'm going to say to you about colour applies to all colours, but I notice it quite often with yellows, because you get colours like this. Now, this is a light sunshiny yellow, and people will often just grab a lemon yellow for this, but it's not really an accurate colour. And I find this often, this yellow, especially in things like flowers as well, this warm yellow, often missing from people's palettes. Now, if you don't have a wide range of colours, you could consider getting an extra yellow, but you also could just take your lemon and warm it up with a bit of something else as well. So let me show you the difference it makes. It's also a colour that's very useful for sunsets. Don't mix some colour samples on top of your nicely finished paintings, because it's a bad idea, but I'm going to do it anyway. So there you are. This is the colour I chose, which is Talon's Rembrandt Cadmium Yellow Light. Let me find another colour. So this is a sample of nickel titanate, which is a much cooler yellow. It's somewhat similar to lemon, but a little less green and more opaque. I did actually use it in the painting on some of the background, but look at the difference. There's a really strong difference there. And if you just grab any light yellow, when actually you have a very specific yellow, you can find that you're just not capturing the essence of the bird. So I want you to think very carefully about your colours. As I said, if you don't have the right yellow, you probably can mix. I will try, I haven't even tried this, so let's just see if it works. I'm going to take a warmer yellow here. This is a diarylide yellow. Let's put a little bit of that into this one here. There you are. Do you see? It's not quite right, but we can easily start to mimic that warm yellow just by mixing a cooler yellow. This one here is actually lemon. I could do the same with lemon, and we can warm that colour up. So do take time before you start your bird painting to make sure you have as accurate as possible the colours that you need. And if you don't have the right colours, could you perhaps mix them from some colours that you already have? Or perhaps it's even worth going and buying another tube of paint. You always want to put maximum effort into getting these small details right. It'll have a big effect on the success of your painting. So my next one is a don't for you, and that's don't be afraid of black or white paint when painting animals, and especially birds. Now you're probably saying to me, well, you're a bit of a hypocrite. You've told me as a beginner to avoid black and white paint. I may have done this, yes, because they can both be quite tricky to handle, but I'm afraid, but especially with white, you're going to need some body colour if you're doing feathers or fur. I'm not saying it's impossible to paint, particularly loose birds you could paint without going into body colour, but if you're going to have any detail around the feathers and any texture of fluffy feathers, you're going to need a little bit of body colour, a little bit of white, and actually there is often a little bit of black within birds and animals, particularly in the eyes and on the beaks or the bills. So let's have a discussion about how to use black and white within your paintings without letting them take over everything and become too invasive. So let's look at the idea of using black and white. Now black is often a very good colour for the centre of a bird's eye or any animal's eye, so we've got black here. Now the reason I tell beginners to stay away from black is because they have a tendency to mix it into all of their other colours. That said, if you have some very neutral colours, particularly if you don't own something like a sepia, then you can use this to adjust some of your brown. So if you've got a warmer brown, you can actually, let me grab a warmer brown, you can actually use black to adjust your brown a little bit. So I've got some burnt sienna here, and you'll see that we can start to get some slightly more neutral browns by adding a little bit of black in. So there are no bad colours. I have nothing inherently against black or white. Technically, of course, they're not colours. I have nothing against using them. It's just that, as I said, beginners do get into trouble with them, but I do think they can be very useful when painting animals. Let's look at white now. So I've got this colour here, which is Jackman's Art Materials Titanium White. So you tend to get two whites within watercolour. You get zinc white, which tends to be labelled watercolour, and then you get titanium white, which is sometimes labelled gouache. To be honest, white is white. They're all opaque to some extent. Zinc white tends to be semi-opaque. For my own purposes, I don't know why I'd bother using a semi-opaque white when white is inherently opaque. You may as well go with a fully opaque white like this one and water it down if you want it to be more transparent. Now, white does several things. You can use it to take colours over other colours, or even just to add white markings on your bird. For instance, with the bird that I painted here, I put some dark shadow onto the underneath of the chin here. I'm calling it chin, I don't know if that's the correct term for a bird. And then I painted little white flecks over the top. So let's have a look at that. Just squeeze a tiny bit of this white out. So I can, if I want to, get some very subtle effects here. Of course, if I had darker paint, it would show up a lot more. You can build it up as well. Sometimes when going on top of other colours, you need to add more. Another thing that white does is it adds this sort of creamy opaque effect. Now this is very useful for the bills of birds. If you saw the toucan that I painted, I'll try and drop a picture of it in now. If you saw the toucan that I painted, the white made a real difference to the bill actually. It gave it that solidity. So there's nothing wrong with using a little bit of white paint within your bird painting, or a little bit of black. Just be careful with the black that you don't just mix it into everything to darken it, because it's lazy and it'll just dull your colours. And be careful with the white that it doesn't pollute your whole palette. I actually suggest, if you're using white paint, to put it out in a separate dish. Keep it away from the colours that you've already, if you've got your colours squeezed out, or pan paints, keep it away from those and mix it where you need to. You can mix it in with other colours for sure, but keep it in a separate palette. And that way you won't get a load of opacity mixed into your general watercolours where you might not need it. At this stage, as always, if you're finding this video of some value to you, if it's useful to you, could I please encourage you to click the like button, the thumbs up. YouTube rewards channels with audience interaction, so if you like, share, subscribe, or even leave me a nice comment, not a nasty comment, a nice comment, YouTube will push this video out to more people, and I'll be able to help teach more people how to paint. So another do for you this time, and this is do use masking fluid for the little highlights in your bird eyes. They're not always on display, but if you can possibly manage to get a highlight in the eye, it's going to help it come to life. I've got another tip at the end of the video that's also going to help you with eyes. But for now, let me show you how effective it can be to use a tiny bit of masking fluid within an eye. Now, you've probably watched my previous videos and you'll know that I'm not the hugest fan of masking fluid, because I've had 20 years experience of teaching classes and seeing people mess up their paintings with masking fluid. But for very specific things, and those things are hard-edged highlights or small sharp white items, it's very, very effective. It's going to be great for getting a tiny highlight in your bird's eye. So let's look at using masking fluid. I've got some masking fluid here, and I've got a ruling pen here, which is what I tend to apply my masking fluid with. I've painted some tiny little eyes here just so I can show you the process. I hope you can see them well enough, but you'll understand anyway. So all I'm going to do is just take a little bit of that masking fluid, really just put a tiny dot, and sometimes it goes over the black part of the eye, and sometimes it even goes into the coloured part too. Just use your reference material to guide you as to where the highlight is in the eye of your particular bird. If there isn't one, you could experiment with putting it on. You know, maybe if you're a little bit more experienced, that might be a good idea. If you're a complete beginner, I'd just go with exactly what you can see in the painting. And then once it's dry, I've done it on this one here and it's dry, we can put the colour of the bird's eye in. And we can go across the whole thing because the black will just go on top. So we can go like this. And you can see I put a little highlight here, and it's just reserved that. Then you would let that dry, as I've done with this one, and then we'll go in and we can then paint the black in the centre. There is actually, I don't know what it is, but something has got on this paper, and it may be a little bit of wax, or even just some sun cream from my arms the other day, but something is resisting the paint a little bit there, but you can see the process, and we'll take an outline around as well. You don't always have an outline, but often there is one. Now it's a little bit scruffy at the moment. I'm going to show you later on in the video how to get a sharper effect than that. But you take those colours on, and then for the final one, which is all dry, all you're going to do is just take your fingers and just rub off the highlight. There we are. And I'm just going to touch that up with a little bit more colour because the masking fluid went over a larger area than I wanted it. And you can see that we can start getting that bright white highlight. Doesn't look very effective on a small picture like this when I'm just doing eyes individually, but once you get the whole bird you can see that it will really bring your bird to life. So my next tip for you is don't be too precise. So it can be really tempting when you're working on something like a bird, or particularly if you've got something like a botanical style, a really detailed style, it can be very easy for it all to become kind of stilted and for it to look more like an ornament than a real bird. So I want to encourage you just to occasionally allow the paint just to flow and to have some lost and found and wet edges so that you don't have too much precision. As you build up, you'll find that this is really, really effective in giving a natural look. So I've got some paint here and it's dried, and I'm going to start putting some detail into this. So let's go on. I've got some raw umber here, so let's have a look at this. And I'll start sort of putting, maybe I'm putting, you know, some feather shapes in, starting to get just the idea of some shapes. But we don't want to be too precise with that. In areas, I'm just going to take some clean water and just allow things to bleed a little bit without losing the shapes too much. I may even want to go in with a little bit of something darker and get a little bit of more of a shadow along one side perhaps. Maybe I'll work into those shapes a bit more. So you can see that I'm getting some kind of shaping going on, but in places I'm allowing things to bleed one area between another, because if I left everything really hard edged and really precise, it wouldn't look natural at all. This isn't how I would leave it. I would continue to work on this. I'm going to show you some of those techniques later in the video. My next tip for you is do work in layers and do allow those layers to dry. So unless you're doing the loosest of birds, you know, you don't want to be painting just in one layer. You're going to need to let areas dry in order to build up that detailed feather texture. Let me show you what I mean. It's going to make a big difference to the realism that you get on the texture of your bird feathers. So really important when you're working that you allow things to dry. So I've drawn a couple of feathers here. So let's say that we had a darker feather in front there, so I could go on the top now and place that in. So if I was working and this these first two feathers were this would be something like wing or tail feathers. If I was working in here and these two other feathers were still wet, the whole of that would bleed. So there are areas of birds that are quite sharp where you need some precision. Again, you could see that when I worked into this area here, the underneath layer was dry, and before I work on top of that anymore, again I would allow that next layer to dry. And as I said, we can just keep working on this one here because we allowed things to dry. So there's a time when you have soft edges and bleeding like we did here, but there's also a time when you allow things to dry. Don't keep working on the bird until everything is wet and everything starts to bleed. Wherever you want a crisp edge, you must make sure that you're painting next to dry paper. So the next thing I want to say to you is don't always work with a completely wet brush. Now, dry brush is a fantastic technique for building up texture, especially things like fine hairs and feathers. Let me show you how it's done. It's going to make an amazing difference to your birds. So dry brush is a technique that's absolutely brilliant for painting feathers and for painting fur. So I've got an old acrylic brush here, a really cheap rubbish brush. So I'm not going to try and do dry brush with something like this. I would ruin the brush. It also just wouldn't work. You need a stiff, scruffy brush. The older and the more rubbish it is, the better it's going to work. And you're literally going to get the paint on the brush fairly dry. And this is where your black and white can really come into their own. So let's get a little bit of black here. I'm just trying to sort of dip in without getting too much water at all. You don't want much water on your brush here at all. And I'm just going to go across like this. That's not bad. I think it needs to be a little bit wetter. If you've picked up quite a lot of paint, what you can do is get a little piece of paper towel and just take the excess moisture off if you need to. If you're not sure how it's going to look, you can practice on a scrap. If you think it might be too wet, practice a little bit on a scrap. And you can see that you can start building up. You can get a linear texture like this, or when it gets really dry, you can almost just get almost kind of a random fluffiness to it. So let me clean that brush and go in with some white paint now. And we're going to start going on top. Now you can see how this works for fur. It also works for feathers. We can work into areas that are dry and start building up shapes. So this is what I was saying about working within layers and start building up that feather technique. dry brush is a really, really good thing to do. Do practice on a scrap of paper before you try it on your painting. And if you're at all unsure, I would always do your first strokes on a scrap of paper before you go onto your main painting, because if you get too much water on your brush, it's not the end of the world, but you're going to have to just sort of wash that out and let it dry before you try it again. My next tip for you is do use watercolor pencils. These are an absolute gift when it comes to bird painting, because there are often lines, particularly between feathers and sometimes down the center of a feather. You get that little straight line. Far easier to put it in with a sharp watercolor pencil than with a brush. Let me show you how it's done. So I've got some watercolor pencils here. This one in particular has been sharpened. This one could do with being sharpened before using. Depends how sharp you want the line really. If you want a soft line, then you want one that's a bit blunter. If you want a sharper line, then you want something that's a bit sharper. So you can work multiple ways with these. You could work onto dry paper. Let's do that first. So I've got some feathers here. So let's imagine that we had a line down the center of this one. So you could take like this. I would always soften a little bit afterwards with clean water, because it's a bit too noticeable that it's pencil otherwise, and we could take in like this. Equally, you can just use it as you go along. So we're painting a feather here. We can get a line down the center. You could even, if you needed to, you could even get more lines like this. Always want to take the watercolor pencil outwards in the direction that the feather is growing, so that you get a natural tapering as you lift it off the paper. You don't want to go the other way because the lines tend to look quite stubby. You can also work into some areas if you've got a slightly blunter watercolor pencil, and you can work in between areas and start getting sort of definition. Now, by working onto wet paper, what will happen is the watercolor pencil will release more pigment. I'm going to change colours just simply because the tone is so similar there, it's probably hard to see on camera. So if you've got feather shapes like this, you want to work in between, you can do that too. So absolutely a multitude of ways that you can work with watercolor pencils. Get those lines in between as well. And you can always go in and soften with a paintbrush. My next tip for you is do use a scalpel to score some lines in your paper. This may sound a bit scary, you may be worried that you'll cut your paper, but actually if you hold your scalpel blade or your craft knife properly, it's really easy to do. Why would you do it? Because you're going to get some beautiful fine lines on your feathers. These are lines that are much finer than you could ever do with a paintbrush or even a watercolor pencil. Let me show you how you can use a scalpel or a craft knife to get realistic feather lines. You'll be amazed at the natural effects that you can get. So let's look at the idea of using a craft scalpel or a craft knife. You want to be careful with this. Obviously you can cut a big hole in your paper, which is not ideal when you're trying to do a nice painting. So you don't want to be holding it upright like this. Now it's really hard sometimes to show this on camera. The angle doesn't always look correct. It sometimes looks like I'm holding it upright and cutting, but I am not. I'm holding it on its side, maybe at the tiniest bit of an angle, but mostly I'm holding the blade flat on its side. So what we're doing is we're not cutting, we're scoring. So let me show you how that works. What happens when you score paper like this with watercolours is that the pigment will be attracted to the little dips, and then when you paint over the top, and I understand you probably can't even see this on camera at the moment, but once you paint over the top, I'll get my paintbrush, what you'll find is that the paint pigment is just attracted to those little lines, and you get these beautiful delicate lines appear. Sometimes you need to go over this a couple of times. We could put some darker paint on it, it'll work even better. Of course, if you go too dark, you won't see it at all, so we can do that as well. It's actually possible to work into wet paint too. Do be careful when doing this one though, because obviously the paper is going to be more fragile if it's wet and you're scraping at it. So even more possibility of cutting your paper. But again, just go into your wet paint and you can score like this. You see the paint just being attracted to those areas and you get these beautiful delicate lines. I mean, I don't have to tell you how good that is for painting feathers. Even if it's just for doing the center line, it can be really, really beautiful and really effective. And it's just one of the techniques that you can use to build up overall texture of feathers. So at the beginning of this video, I encourage you to watch all the way to the end so that you could see a bonus tip, and here it comes. So I'm going to show you actually part of me working on the painting that I just finished. So I'm going to show you the finishing touches that I put on my previous bird painting, the one that I showed you at the beginning where I was choosing the yellow colours. And we're actually going to use a pen, but no one is going to be able to see that we've even gone near it. If they can't see it, why would we even do it? Let me show you and everything will become clear. So I've got a bit of a sneaky trick here for you, and what I'm doing is I'm just taking a permanent liner pen and I'm sharpening up the outside of the eye. Look at that. I wouldn't normally recommend that you use a pen just in one area of a painting like this, but I'm actually going on top of an area that I've painted. I'm just sharpening up that edge. It's a really clever trick. Nobody will know that you've done it, and it's just going to give that eye that sharpness and that circular effect, because there's never any softness around the outside of an eye. It's always this, hard edged shiny object, and it's just going to help to bring your bird to life. So do let me know in the comments which of these tips you found most useful, and before you leave this video, don't forget to pop into those comments and grab one of my free downloadable PDFs. You can get that for no money whatsoever. Lots of advice there to help you with your painting and drawing. If you need more help than I can give you in a short video, I do have online courses for you. You'll find details of those all in the video description as well as on my website. If you enjoyed using the watercolour pencil in this video and you'd like to see some more ways of using it to enhance your watercolour paintings, I've got a great video that's going to show you lots of different ways that I use watercolour pencils within my own watercolour paintings to enhance them and add details. You can watch that video right now.